especially if you're someone, and we'll talk through that scenario, if you're someone who's looking to grow as a leader, managing perception and increasing your impact are really, really intertwined. And the perceived impact you have is very hard to detangle from the impact you're actually having.
Hey everyone, welcome to Dev Interrupted. I'm Connor Bronston, Dev Interrupted executive producer and occasional guest host. Today I'm joined by Lena Reinhard. Lena, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So for those who don't know Lena in the audience, she's an acclaimed international keynote speaker and authority on topics like leadership, DevOps transformation, and organizational scale. And she's worked with CEOs, team leads at startups, and everyone in between, helping teams everywhere increase their effectiveness, scale for performance, and achieve sustainable growth. She's also the former VP of product engineering at Circle CI. And Lena, I'm really excited to have you on the show today.
I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, this episode is particularly fun for us because we've honestly never done anything like this before. You are renowned for your ability to foster transformational change within teams. And when we were prepping for this episode and doing research in your approach, and started to learn more about your process, we kind of figured, hey, let's get the full treatment. So for anyone listening, we're about to settle into one of Lena's I'm really off today. Lena's famous workshops. And I'm going to be doing it from the perspective of an individual contributor who's just kind of leveled up to team lead at a scale up. It's important to note that this conversation will be applicable not just to devs or individual contributors, but also to VPs of engineering and even CTOs. The way Lena conducts these exercises, they're more about breaking out of your preconceived notions than they are about prescribing to a title or to a specific organization. So if you're a VP, director of engineering, founder, we encourage you to follow along as well and think about how you would answer these questions if Lena was sitting in her office or on a Zoom call like right now. So Lena, let's get started here. This is going to be fun.
Awesome. Let's do it.
So I know you wanted to start off with perception and how to build a better perception of our work. That's the topic that our listeners voted on, and you were really excited about it. But I want to give a little more background before we do that about who you are and what you do. Can you give us maybe like a quick 2-minute summary of your career? I know it's hard to work everything in there, but I'd love for the listeners to get to know you a little more.
Yeah, of course. So I've been at it for almost 20 years at this point, and I have a cross-functional background. I've worked in finance, in media, in arts, and the majority of my time I've spent in tech though, and I've sort of stuck with that and had a lot of fun on the journey. So I initially, honestly, had never pegged myself as someone starting to run teams, and let alone enjoying that, but here we are. And so the last decade I've spent growing and running engineering teams across the globe. And from NGOs to early stage startups to pre-IPO stage was basically anything in there. I had my own software as a service startup for a while. I was a co-founder and CEO there, which was a really exciting time as well. We were bootstrapped at the time, so that's also a special experience, I'd say. And I've, along the way, basically discovered that I have this passion for people and helping people navigate systems. And by systems, I mean both sort of technical systems as well as systems within organizations, systems of people. And there's a lot of intricacies to that. And there's a lot that helps people be effective in their work and sort of show up as leaders in particular. And now I get to do more of that. And I now do it in a few different functions, mostly in coaching, which we're going to do a little bit of today, which I'm very excited about. So I coach engineering executives and leaders, mostly more senior folks. And I also do consulting for a variety of teams, and I train management teams in topics like the one that we're going to cover today. So that's my work, and that's that system angle and helping people navigate those systems through the thing that I really care about.
See, I can tell you're a coach because, when I told you, hey, let's do a 2-minute intro, you really nailed it, right? Like just on, concise, you had a great story. I got excited from it. So this has really got me excited for this episode.
Is that coaching training really worth it?
I can already tell this is going to be a great episode. I do want to dig into one thing you mentioned. You mentioned that you bootstrapped and founded a startup. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So the startup's actually still around. It's called Neighborhoody, and shout out to my former team. And we co-founded the company in 2014, which feels like forever ago. And at the time, we had gotten together because we'd all been working on open source projects together. And actually, I got to know some of my co-founders also through working on CouchDB. The database is the word. And so we worked on CouchDB together, and we then decided to found a company in order to support some of the open source work and make that more sustainable. And we did start doing some software development ourselves with some of our employees. One software that we built at the time was later integrated into Sneak, which is very exciting. And we did some consulting because, as you do as a bootstrap startup, you've got to pay rent somehow. And so we consulted, and that's how I got into some of my first management roles as well.
And I'm guessing it's how you started doing this consulting coaching gig too.
Exactly. Yeah. So the initial consulting work that we did was basically starting to build teams for the corporations and at the time NGOs that we worked for. And that's how I discovered my passion for leadership, which I've kind of had all along. I did at some point remember that my first boss when I was 18 told me, Ms. Reinhard, you're going to be a boss one day. And that was my first performance evaluation in any job that I've ever gotten, and they were not wrong.
Hey, whoever they were, they nailed it.
Gonna have to message them on LinkedIn.
Yes, thanks for calling that one. Should listen earlier.
Yeah, seriously.
So one important thing in open source projects and when you're bootstrapping your own company as well is the perception of the work you're doing. Whether it's trying to get people to come join your team or getting support within a community to, push a version that you believe in. It's important to kind of build that community support, build support within your team. And it's also the topic that our own Dev Interrupted community on Discord and on our social media has voted that they want to talk about here in this episode is how can I build a better perception of my work? So I'd love to kind of start with, let's define what perception is, make sure we have a, even definition here for everyone who's listening, and kind of dig into how to approach that.
Mm-hmm. I was really amazed that people voted this topic because I'm so excited to dig into this, because it's honestly also something that for a long time in my own career, I've really underestimated and wish I had paid much more attention to much sooner. And perception is so fascinating to me because it's so complex. First of all, there is sort of the neurological side of it. We and our brains, we organize, we identify, we interpret information to help us make sense of the world. And so perception is really key in that. And it initially starts with these signals, like with what we see, what we hear, what we smell. Those trigger our nervous system, which then also triggers physical or chemical stimulation in our sensory system. And there's these two really intriguing parts to it. There's one sort of the signal, which you could technically even measure objectively, for example, how loud something is or what noise you're hearing. And then there's the other part, which is not about the signal anymore, but about the recipient. And that recipient really shapes the way that perception actually works, because their attention plays a huge role. Like, are they actually listening? Then their memory, are they remembering things that you just said? What expectation do they have? Depending on their own expectation, what you're doing or saying may land in very different ways. Then there's their own learning. Another word for that is biases. So their preconceived notions that they're bringing. Then there's their attitude, their motives, their values. All of those notions go into their perception as well. There's really just a couple examples that I could give. For example, if you are someone who really values concise written communication, then you may be put off by someone who has a preference for long form. And that may be a thing that happens consciously. Oh, perfect. That may be something that happens consciously or even subconsciously. Or another example might be if a team leader is a really goal achievement oriented person, any team member who gives an excuse for something not being done might be perceived as someone who's lazy or not as enthusiastic about the job. So there's even, like, if you think about, for example, impressionist paintings, they play with that as well, or optical illusions, where essentially what you're looking at from very far away looks very different from what you're seeing if you're getting close up.
This is really useful context. I think starting with the neurological side of it and saying, hey, we all have this thing going on within our own brains, but so does the person or persons who we are communicating with, is a really important thing to signal. And that sometimes it's very unconscious, these biases or these triggers that we're having happen within our physical or chemical sensory systems. And honestly, a couple of the examples you used resonated with as someone who does lead a team, and we're going to get into this more in the specific coaching piece of this, but I have to really pause myself sometimes because I would say like one of my big strengths and weaknesses is I have a bias for action. Like, oh, great, we got the parameters, let's go do this. And that doesn't always fit with all my team members. Some of them are much deeper thinkers, honestly, than I am, and want that time to contemplate. Whereas I'm like, I need to start trying something in order to figure out how I really think about it. I have to get that like hands-on experience. And so I think for me, like one of my big learnings of how I perceive my team, and also I think how they perceive me, I'm sure, is trying to put that effort into saying, okay, like we have different learning styles and I have to accommodate and work with those folks. And also then that if we do it right, like we can both get the benefit of each other's strengths.
Right. And I love that call out, and I love that you're so cognizant of that, because I think I'll keep saying that a couple more times today, but there is no truth. Like there is no objective truth in perception. And there are some ways to approximate towards that truth, and we'll get into some of those. But in the end, it's about recognizing those differences and managing those and figuring out, well, can we meet halfway? And I think that is a really crucial bit in all of this. So I'm glad that, you pulled this out for yourself and as a leader already.
Well, I can do it after the fact. I can't always do it, in the moment. So I'm still working at it.
Fair. And I think that's also really hard because I don't want to create that impression that it's just a negative thing that we're talking about, because these perceptions are also really helpful. Even the biases you mentioned. In the end, the reason we have all these biases is because they make us help sense of the world much faster. They help us categorize information because we think we've already seen it. Now that can absolutely get in the way of being effective or of doing a good job. But in the first place, they're also incredibly useful.
Yeah. To your point around, human categorization and fitting things into structures, a big part of why our brains work that way is because it simplifies our lived environment and our experience so that we can focus on the new things we have. Taking on too many new things at once gives this really deep cognitive load. Whereas if you can live, a percentage of your life within habits or systems that you can kind of attach meaning to because you've already experienced similarities, it's a lot easier to then take on these new projects or fit them into an existing framework.
And it's interesting that you're mentioning that, because it made me think of, many organizations that are moving really fast at this point, that are dealing with a high degree of change, and where leaders in particular have to deal with a high change rate, but then also a high ambiguity that comes with that, and the ability to context switch at all times, where again, sort of the tendency to move into preconceived notions may be even stronger because it's the only way to handle the flood of information you're dealing with.
Yeah. And I'll say on the product side for us, bit of a tangent, but like one of our big focuses right now is how do we reduce context switching? How do we make these kind of, as we've moved to this asynchronous world that is very distributed for a lot of teams, it's easy to have, a million Slack messages. You have to update your all your Jira pieces as well. There's so much going on, and kind of like a PR request come at any time, and reducing that context switching is a really important part of what we're doing at Linear B is trying to say, okay, how can we give people their focus time back? So to give an example of a company I think that's doing it really well, I don't know if you use Clockwise for your calendar, but great integration for Google Calendar. A couple of our other guests like Catherine Kohler from Netflix have talked about it before, but it defrags your calendar for you, and you can kind of mark calendar meetings as, movable within a day or flexible within the week. And it will stack meetings together to create focus time for everyone who's involved in the meeting. And honestly, it saves me so much time.
Yeah. I know so many people that I work with who are sort of desperate for that focus time. And I think it's something that a lot of people are really craving.
Yeah. Well, Well, so we actually did a study and found that, most devs are not actually coding for more than 2 hours a day. It's, meetings, it's overhead, it's time to think, that time where, they just need to pause and kind of unplug before they go in and actually do the work of coding. And maximizing that time is obviously better for the organization, give people more time to problem solve. But to your point, there's so much overhead. And a lot of that, frankly, I think has to do with how are we being perceived within our organization?
Mhm.
How is the team up to the support they need? I.e., do they have the perception from leadership that they need?
Mhm.
So this is all resonating for me very strongly.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because the way that you want, like the perception that you want to create may also impact how you're spending that focus time, actually. I was just thinking of the sort of different elements that are to that perception, sort of come around to that topic again. But there is, of course, always sort of other people and how they perceive us. And I'll dig into that briefly in a second. Then there's the environment that we're in, which is really important as well and not to be underestimated. And then the third part is, of course, how we show up, how we spend our focus time, for example. And I'd love to briefly dig into each of these components because I think understanding those is going to be really helpful for digging into perception a bit more. Awesome. So let's just start with other people because those are always fun to talk about. Obviously, other people's perception is worth spelling out. It just differs with each person, depends on their values, expectations, attention span, all the things we've covered earlier. It's highly subjective, and the way the perception is created can often be incredibly subtle. And I think that's one of the really tricky things about it. It can be in how you talk, how you ask questions, it can even be in how you dress. There's great studies on that. And it can even be in the way you smell. And like if there's basically from a chemistry perspective, people find that off-putting. And these biases are super interesting that play into that. Like there's a fantastic study where researchers at Yale had subjects hold hot drinks in their hands, and people who held a hot drink in their hands perceived others' personalities as warmer than people who held cold drinks in their hands.
Really?
So I'm glad you're having a coffee. It's fair enough.
I know, but folks who aren't watching.
Really plays in my favor here. You're going to really love our conversation as long as this beverage keeps going.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, please do. That'd be really helpful. Or this whole thing that like tall people are perceived as much more suitable for leadership roles. Again, plays in my favor. I'm a tall person. I don't know how about you, but perfect. Yeah. Same. We're doing great for ourselves here. But again, it's nothing that we actually, that has nothing to do with our leadership skills, unfortunately.
Whoa, don't say that right here. Sorry,
didn't want to project.
You're dealing with your perception.
It's actually fair. Really doing harm to the brand. But it's exactly the point. Like this very easily, like things that may be like funny or like kind of harmless, but a bit weird, like very easily lead to stereotyping voluntarily or involuntarily. And the thing that I sometimes tell people is that even with like the work you do, it can often not be even about the work you do or the results you achieve, but the way that you talk about it, the way that people perceive you. And differentiating between those things can be incredibly hard. And it's worth always keeping in mind that it has nothing to do with someone's value. It's not reality, but it can basically, perception can become a clash between how we view ourselves and how others view us. And basically this delta in between is the big question that we need to figure out how to bridge.
I think that's a really good point. And I like that you're bringing it back to perception is not reality. But I also think it's important to understand that while it may not actually be reality, to the other person it is. Like we have to consider that the way they are perceiving things, we have to have enough like empathy within ourselves as leaders to have that conversation, understand where they're coming from. And maybe we want to try to persuade them to a different viewpoint because we think their perception is altered for one biasy or lack of information or whatever else might be. But we can't just, I don't want to say accept, but we can't just go with their perception. We also need to, I think as leaders, one of our big roles is how do we transform others' perceptions of ourselves? And that's, I think, what we're going to get into here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're making an important point there in that, like, we obviously can't control other people and what they think and how they perceive us. But there is something to how we show up that is absolutely in our control. And we'll get into some things that people can try in a second. And there's this, even one more level down, there's this interesting dynamic where we may even show up in different ways without us realizing. There's a great study that was done on having people wear doctor's coats, and the people who did wear these coats performed significantly better in cognitive tasks than the people who did not wear these coats, or the people who had just looked at these coats. So basically to say,
our own
those people just exactly, or the way that we show up, for example, through the way that we dress. Clothes can put us into a different state mentally than we may be realizing, or it may be other circumstances. Maybe you just had a really intense meeting, you look tired, you're speaking in a different way, you're not paying attention, and suddenly that changes perception without you actually being aware of it. So those are these subtleties that are incredibly hard to control for, and that we're also not going to get into today too much because they're just really difficult. But I just wanted to highlight that those things can even play a role without us realizing.
You know, it does actually highlight something in my own life that I don't think about a ton. Like I'll say is, so for those watching on YouTube, you can see like I have a bit of a beard going, and working from home as I do, I typically don't shave everything. I don't clean it up even, you know, like, and yet I know when I do, I feel like a sense of confidence when I, you know, spend the time to do so. That's honestly, as we're talking, I think that's the way I should do a little more, just for my own perception of myself, if nothing else, because, you know, I feel that sense of confidence of like, oh yeah, like you're clean today, you look good. Like maybe that's worth it for me.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's a nice way to, you know, play around with perception that we're going to get into a bit more as well. It's like noticing those things about yourself. I love that self-reflection that you have there. And that's also come up earlier already with, like, you know, noticing these patterns, noticing these behaviors, and being able to say, okay, well, I'm going to use that to actually try and change something.
Well, I'm noticing. I'm yet to start implementing. So we're working on that.
We'll get there.
Give it time on the podcast, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it also, you actually brought up something there that I think is really important, which is the environment again, sort of the places where we show up. There's another interesting study that's really famous in the psychology community. The Rosenhan study is what it's called. The whole basically idea or notion is that there's a high context dependency of diagnoses of mental health issues. And of course, we're not talking about mental health issues today, but we're talking about other sort of stimuli affecting our brain. And the study that was done was essentially that they had people show up at clinics and they were exhibiting symptoms of mental health issues. And they only exhibited those symptoms for 1 or 2 days, and then stopped. But all of them, or the majority of them at least, had to remain at the clinic and were not discharged for quite a while. And some of them, even when they were discharged, the doctors basically said, hey, you still have these mental health issues. The whole point of the study being that there's a huge context dependency to mental health topics, for example, where essentially the context in which you view things really matters. And I think it's similar with topics like perception, the way that we look at others. For example, this you mentioned earlier, this default or bias to action, that's something that might fly really well and actually be a really appreciated trait in like a smaller company, a startup environment, whereas a company that's much more corporate has a much different sort of set of values and operational modes. That's where something like that might be absolutely frowned upon, and where suddenly what made you successful in a role may be the thing that actually gets you really negative feedback. So that context dependency and the environment is really important to keep in mind there as well.
And to your point, this perception really matters. Like we can think, oh, well, I don't care how others perceive me. I myself, I feel comfortable in my own skin. But with our work environment, I mean, promotions, raises, what responsibilities we get, our reputation, which kind of like leads to all these things. There's so many impacts to perception.
Yeah, exactly. And especially if you're someone, and we'll talk through that scenario, if you're someone who's looking to grow as a leader, managing perception and increasing your impact are really, really intertwined. And the perceived impact you have is very hard to detangle from the impact you're actually having. And there's a lot of processes in like maturing organizations that are trying to counter all of these perception topics. Like, for example, performance reviews that are being standardized, 360 feedback, generally feedback processes. All of these things are trying to sort of quote unquote make more objective that whole process. And it's an attempt to make something inherently subjective more measurable and quantifiable and reduce some of these biases, sometimes more, sometimes less successful. And one important part that I want to call out there is that, like with any type of biases, the risk of members of underrepresented groups being impacted by those disproportionately compared to members of sort of the majority is always there. And I think that's really important to keep in mind for this perception topic in particular as well, just because it also may mean depending on your identity, depending on where you're at in your career or who you are and what you bring to your workplace, it may also mean that you're dealing with very different perception challenges than some other people might.
And that affects hiring, internal promotion, so much more. I think that's a really important call out here.
Exactly, yeah.
I do feel like it's hard to change perception though. Once people have this like settled view, like there's this whole idiom about, first impressions, right? First impressions are lasting ones. And how do we start to alter that perception?
And I think a lot of people struggle with that because it's like a part of it is essentially marketing your own work. And that starts with like understanding your audience and your target group and then thinking about yourself also from a bit of a distance, because it's not just about again, like the things you do, but it's the way that others see those things. And getting that distance can also be emotionally complicated. Like many of us identify a lot with our work and the impact that we have, and taking that distance can be tricky. Other people deal with imposter syndrome and already feel like they're not doing enough, and now other people kind of say that too. Now, what does that even mean? It can also be really hard, and like some environments are really, I'd call it aggressive or really fast moving or have a bit of a quote unquote bro culture, where that becomes even more important because it may feel like some people are putting their elbows out. And with that, it can be very confusing. It can feel very personal, even though, again, I keep saying it's not, but of course it can feel that way. And it's something that we're never taught. I think a lot of people are brought up we're basically said, hey, you have to do the work. You need to do the right thing and people will notice. But that's just unfortunately not always the case. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic context setting here for this conversation we're having. And if you're ready, I'd love to dive in.
I was going to say, let's dive in.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So I'll just reiterate for the audience really quickly. I am, in this case, I'm a team lead at a scale up, and I'm here to try to improve the perception of my work. I guess I've already identified I need to shave regularly, but excited for this. I'll let you take it away. Pass the mic.
Awesome. So the first thing that I would just be curious to hear from you about is like, where are you at with this perception of your work? Like, what's on your mind at the moment?
I'm a new leader, or relatively new. I've been doing this role for a few months now. And, I mentioned this earlier in the conversation, but some of the skills that made me a really excellent individual contributor of, having this bias to action, going and doing the work, it's not working as well with some of my team members. Like some of them just have a different, learning style or approach where they, maybe they need to go for a walk and you kind of think through what they're doing before they start putting code to keyboards kind of. And, so internally things are okay within my team, but, I know I can improve there. And then I would say like externally within the organization, honestly, I haven't had a ton of time to think about it. Like my performance reviews have been solid, but I would love to improve that impact.
Yeah. What does improving that impact mean to you?
Oh, wow. That's a really great question. In the long run, I'm ambitious. I do want to move up. I want to get paid more. I want to be able to have a bigger voice within the organization. I long-term could see myself growing into like a director role, maybe, or more. I have some interest in maybe founding a company someday. I have some ideas. I mean, this great, technical infrastructure, that I think could be applied to other problems. So I don't feel ready for that yet. And I want to grow my impact within, the scale up I'm at now so that I do feel ready to make that next leap.
Yeah. So it essentially sounds like there's two and a half parts of it. The one part being sort of your current team, the way they perceive you. And it sounds like you have a bit of clarity there already, that there's some, say, misalignment or differences in working styles, and in operational modes. The other part being more sort of the external facing outside of your team, trying to basically grow your role, grow your impact. And then the third part also, that being part of your thinking about your future growth, essentially, and wanting to use the current role as sort of a way to experiment.
I'd even add one more thing, which is,
Yep.
we're a distributed team. I'd done hybrid roles before going into the pandemic, but it has been a bit of a transition. And, I've listened to some leaders who've come on this podcast and before talk about, like Darren Murph from GitLab saying, hey, you need to be much more intentional about your organizational design and your team design when you're remote. And I guess I'm a little worried that I'm going to be recognized within my current environment, and I want to make sure that I'm paying attention to it.
Awesome. Well, thanks for adding that. And again, I love the reflection you bring to this already. So my next question would be, what's your effect on others? What's your impact on others?
One area that I really want to grow in, and that I feel is an opportunity to grow, is my ability to coach team members. I mentioned this bias for action.
Yeah.
I believe I have strong skills. That's what got me recognized and moved up the ladder. And I want to improve my ability to share those in an appropriate way with my team. And I think we talk about increasing impact, but helping increase my team's impact, I know will increase my perception within the organization, and increase my own impact as an extension of my team. And honestly, it just would feel good to be, integral to the company's success.
Yeah. What's interesting to me there is that it sounds like you have some clarity already about, potential for growth when it comes to your own team, some areas there, but it sounds a bit more vague when it comes to the sort of external part, to the rest of the company. Where could you potentially have blind spots?
Where could I have blind spots? I mean, I'll say I haven't thought outside of the engineering org much. I know that there's this discussion within, consulting or coaching about, hey, are you managing stakeholders that you wouldn't necessarily consider? And just frankly, I'm busy in my day to day. I, work meeting with team members, doing work myself, maintaining our org. It's hard for me to spend time reaching out to other orgs to kind of build that perception. And also, we've had to look at some hiring. We're trying to continue to scale, and I am being brought into some of these hiring processes, and it's really hard right now. And it's also hard to retain folks because the hiring market's so tough.
It's tough, yeah. Well, it sounds like you're under a lot of pressure, and you have a lot of tactical items that you're responsible for getting out.
I think part of the challenge is still being partially in an IC role, and also trying to do management at the same time has been challenging.
Right. Yeah. Well, it sounds like a transition you're going through, and correct me if that doesn't jive with you, but it sounds like you're moving from this sort of person who's been incredibly successful, who has this bias to action. You're trying to level up to someone who's becoming successful through others.
Yeah. I think that's a really...
And figuring out how to do that and make people aware of it at the same time. Sorry, go on.
100%. No.
Yeah. So if you're sort of taking a couple steps back, I know you haven't had a lot of time for that, so let's do that now. If you're taking a couple steps back and looking at sort of the system of people around you, what are you seeing? What patterns are coming up?
So, I mean, I'm going to align this again to something I mentioned earlier, which is,
Yeah.
I think a lot of the folks who get promoted within our team are really good individual contributors, but don't necessarily
Mm-hmm.
have like training on how to manage folks. Like I know I would love some more training, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's informal or formal, about how
Mm-hmm.
to lead a team better. Because
Mm-hmm.
we talked earlier about this biases people have. Like, yeah, I'm 6'1", that's great. People think I can lead a team,
Yeah.
but that doesn't actually impact my team leadership at all. The other things I'll say is like, I just think there's a lot of lost time that's happening with the inefficiencies of some of our communication. I think that's an
Mm-hmm.
organizational thing. I think it's happening in a lot of teams. We have
Yeah.
Slack, we have Zoom, we've got email,
Right.
we're making comments on PRs. There's just so many little moving parts. And particularly now that I am interfacing with upper management a lot more, I'm
Mm-hmm.
starting to just feel like pulled in all these different directions.
Right. Yeah. So I just want to, like one item that I'd like to pull out as a potential action item for later, and we can bet those at the end, but would be, you mentioned, you would really like some leadership training. I do think it's really important to also acknowledge like what areas you would like some support in, which areas you could use some training in or so. So it's just gather that or put a pin in it.
Right.
The other part that is interesting to me is that it really sounds like you're trying to pull yourself up, but you feel like you're getting sort of bogged down or keeping sort of
I know my
anchored.
team has a bit of a disconnect from upper leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And because I have a bit of one, and I have, I would say, like more access and transparency just a little bit, but it's hard for us sometimes to see like how, the features we're building really impact the broader business sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting because it also goes back to the role that you're trying to play in sort of, you're trying to step up into a space that sounds like it's not being filled at the moment. Like there is a bit of a vacuum with sort of no one making that connection. Like, would you see yourself as the person who does that, who bridges that gap between corporate direction goals versus the team and the team?
I'd like to, like, I can say
Yep.
I've read some studies around this. I know Google did a really big one, which is that, team members, when they feel connected and like their work makes an impact,
Yeah.
are much more satisfied, perform better. And I know that's true for me too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that high performing teams research that's like really, really important. Yeah. So basically it sounds like you have some good ideas already or concrete ideas for the role you want to play, and the work you want to do, as well as the perception you want to create. Can you, in like one sentence, summarize what that perception is that you want to create?
That I not only perform well in my individual work, but make others around me improve, or help others around me improve.
Yeah. Awesome. Who's your target audience? Like, who are the people who you want to have that perception?
My VP,
Yeah.
our directors. I mean, I'd love to have it go up to our CEO, but sometimes there's not that visibility. I guess leadership here would be my preference. I'm not looking for a new job, so the outside market isn't as important here right now.
Yeah. Out of this group, are there one or two people who you would want to start with, who you think are like most crucial in this?
I have a good relationship with my VP, and I think he really guides what the decisions made in the organization. So I'd say that would be an obvious one for me.
Yeah. So you mentioned the sort of summary that you're being perceived as someone who's successful through others. So that would basically be how your VP knows that, like, you're growing in your role.
I think that would be success for me. Yeah.
Yeah. What would success mean just for you personally? Is that the same, or is there some difference to it?
I'm uncertain on the answer to that.
Fair.
I think there's a lot of that for sure. like showing my growth as a leader. And then I think there would also be like, hey, is your planning accuracy of your team high? Are you delivering on the features you've committed to? Is the code quality high? I know they're metrics that are being considered.
Yeah. It's also interesting. One thing that I just want to highlight there is what we talked about earlier around the control we have over perception. One thing that could be worth for you to dig into a little bit more could be basically, what do you feel like you've done enough to improve the perception or change the perception that others have of you? Just because I think it's really important to have a clear goal of the perception you want to create, but ultimately there's only so much you can actually do to change someone's mind. And
so benchmarking what success looks like.
Exactly. So benchmarking what success looks like, both when it comes to others' perception as well as what you need to do in order to feel like you've succeeded.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. I think that's a really poignant point, though.
And we can also, just park the question for now, and you can just keep it for reflection later on.
What would be examples from other, coaching sessions you've had that maybe would resonate?
So one thing that some people go is basically honestly effort-based. Because obviously measuring outcomes is really important, big fan, but again, you can't control the outcomes entirely. So a lot of people go with, for example, experiments they've run, like things they've tried. Like say they want to try 4 different things over the course of X months or weeks, or they want to involve n number of stakeholders, or they want to get feedback from a couple more people. So essentially, really tuning into what does it feel for me to actually put the work into this project? How much can I dedicate to it, to changing this perception? And then what do I need to feel good about it? And that's very individual. For some people, it's also that they just basically say, I'm going to give this another 3 months, and if it doesn't work, then I'm out of here, for example. So that can also be a piece there.
So I think about this kind of improvement process in like 30 and 90-day chunks. So I think for me, what would make sense would, okay, over the course of this next quarter, I'm going to have 3 like 30-day, we'll call them sprints. And for each one, I'm going to implement or experiment with one perception grower. And, given 30 days, and then I can pivot, or I can keep it and add another experiment.
Love that. Yeah, it does. This is really good. I love the structure. I also love sort of building in some reflection. And I also would add to that, note observations over those 30 days, like write down the things you're doing, write down some observations that you're capturing. One, it can be really helpful to have something to reflect upon later, because we easily forget those sort of small moments. And it can also be super helpful as a way to actually mark your improvements. So actually, let's get to some things that you could try. So we've talked about your stakeholders. We have a sense of the mission you're on. What can you try out?
It's a great question. I think one important one would probably be communication and how I communicate what my team's working on upwards. I think that's one that's clear to me. I don't know exactly what that step could be. Maybe it's adding a weekly async touch point where I kind of do a more full report to give context to the information that the leadership is seeing. That could be an option. Within my team, so thinking about like, how do I improve internal structure? I think that's an important one to think about as well. I almost want to say like I mentioned, I have that bias for action, and it can be good and bad. I would almost say trying to track whenever I'm making decisions from that framework with my team, and making sure that the folks who I've kind of categorized as like having this other method, are being supported in that method. And so maybe like tracking how I communicate with those team members to make sure that it aligns with what they need.
Yeah.
And then the third, I'm not sure.
These are great ideas, though. Like, I loved the part when it comes to like, let's look at the exec or VP interface that you talked about. Having that weekly report, I think is a great idea. How could you start this small?
Maybe it's just a Slack message with some bullet points of, hey, just want to give you a quick update on our team's progress on the feature we're working on. Here's a little context to what you may be seeing in our metrics dashboard.
Yep. Awesome. And I really love that you emphasized context a couple times, which is so crucial because people often have access to metrics already, but usually the story is in the context. And so focusing on that is awesome. I would also encourage you to ask for feedback, check, is this format useful for you? What else would you like to know? So you can already start iterating on that over time.
Yeah, I think the iteration point is something I definitely need to consider. Like I think about some of these things, but I don't necessarily implement like a clear reflection plan and iteration plan on them.
And so building that in basically from the start and say, okay, I'm always going to just ask for feedback might be helpful to help you shift that a little. The second aspect you mentioned was about the team that you're on. And I like the idea of basically tweaking your approaches for the people who have different work styles from yours. I would like to challenge you to take it one step further.
Okay.
And to, you can choose either observe or even start changing already the way that you show up towards your team, because it sounded, from what you described earlier to me, it sounded like there's a ton of stuff that lands up on your plate. There's a lot of decisions that you have to make. And at the same time, you're feeling sort of anchored by the team, but you're trying to elevate yourself. So 2 things you can do. One is you can just observe and basically observe, how are you showing up in meetings with the team? What decisions are you making? What things are landing on your desk that you actually don't want to show up on your desk anymore? And starting to just keep a log of that for 2 weeks and then revisit from there. The secret I will tell you is when a coach asks you to observe something, they usually really mean it for you to just observe, but it usually also starts impacting people's behaviors, which is the nice thing.
So I'll start implementing you, even if you're just telling me where it's at. Yeah.
Even if I'm just yeah. And it's like, can be a gentle way to start changing behaviors, but don't tell anyone. And so that would be on one option. So basically just observing. The other option, if you want to go more radical, could be to basically say you shift your role towards your team and you rethink your interface with your team from the person through which a lot of things run to the coach, the leader, the person who asks questions, the person who, when someone says, hey, can you help me with this, asks, okay, what do you need? And then figures out not the best way for you to solve this problem, but the best way for you to enable them. So those are 2 scenarios. I don't know what you feel more inclined to, but...
No, that resonates with me. To actually use an example from someone we've had on the podcast, we had Maria Gutierrez, who's the VP of engineering at Twitter, on the podcast last year. She was our live Interact guest in 2021. And she shared with us at the time something that I really felt, which was, hey, like, one of my biggest areas in my career is I became a blocker for my team because I was being like superwoman and handling things, and people would go, oh, don't worry, Maria will catch up, Maria will handle that. But then because of that, it took longer to deploy things. And she was this like single point of failure. And that was a big learning experience for her. So I kind of heard that. And I guess now months later, I'm kind of realizing, okay, I can't do the same thing.
And it's one thing to always find to hear those things and then to realize, oh, I'm actually doing that exact same thing as well.
Absolutely.
So you have some things you can try with your team, but you mentioned there was a third area that you are less certain about.
Yeah. Well, so if we just break it down to my like 30 30-30-90 in this case framework of like, okay, I want to try 3 changes. I'm not sure what that third thing should.
For your last,
for like, what am I
30
trying to
days.
implement here as an experiment?
Yeah. So we've covered your main target audiences. You have sort of shifting your leadership approach with your team. You have some reporting with your VP. Is there anything else that feels really important in this whole topic?
I guess maybe if things aren't going well internally, or maybe I don't have the opportunity I want, I would probably want to improve my external perception to improve my odds of being hired somewhere else. If I were to want to change, that might be a good example.
Yeah. So external perception and sort of creating your odds of being hired. What would you like to do in that area? Do you have any idea?
Create visibility. I think that's something that can happen internally as well, but I found that creating like evergreen documents that, or more long-lived documentation, is something that is, I think, rewarded and helpful not only for internal perception, but
yeah, absolutely. Like if you have something there, like that sounds like a really great idea. Another thing you could explore if you'd like is, you could write about this process.
Yeah.
Like you're working on something there and you may not want to publish it immediately or so, but or you could reflect, like it sounds like you're going through a really big transition in your leadership role. That could also be something worth like talking about somewhere. As you're sort of, because it's something that's like a quite common journey and something that I think a lot of people like struggle with. And so sharing your experience might be really helpful for others.
I'm going to jump back into host mode for 30 seconds here and just plug the fact that we do accept guest submissions to Dev Interrupted. If you ever want to write an article, anyone who's listening about engineering leadership, go ahead and jump on our Discord, shoot me a DM. We'd love to have your submissions. We'll publish them. They'll go across the internet. A lot of our articles make it onto the top of programming subreddits of Reddit. You should totally do that. Jumping back into the coaching session. I think the thing I would worry about is having the time to do like formal writing around it. Is there maybe a way I could improve internal external perception by doing like short form?
So you mentioned earlier also that you're working on a distributed team.
Yes.
And I think that's important to keep in mind. I think short form, maybe it's a weekly update to your team. You mentioned earlier there's a bit of a context breakdown between, larger company goals and then the question of sort of how the team's goals align with that. It sounds like the team might benefit from you, bridging that gap on a weekly basis and saying, hey, here's what we did. Here's how that connects to larger goals. And that could even be as short as a Slack message. I do think, the call out to keeping these things small is really important because I would love for you to be able to iterate, experiment, and try a couple things out without having to start these mega projects in addition to all the things you already have on your plate.
And to jump again back to host mode here really quick, I'll just say like on a personal level, I find if you're doing team updates, a lot of the times you kind of anonymize or share a piece of that as like a great LinkedIn update if you do want to improve internal, external perception. I think it's been really helpful for me outside of this coaching session.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's a really good tip though. I love that.
You also mentioned something about finding sponsors to like back you internally, or I'm assuming this also could be external mentors sometimes. How should I think about that as someone who maybe isn't considering that right now?
Yeah. I think sponsorship is honestly one of the most crucial and worthwhile tools for growing your career. And also if you want to sponsor someone to help someone else grow their career. So the whole idea is that it basically extends beyond mentorship, where you're not just sharing experience, but you're actively invested in someone's growth, in someone's career. You're putting their name forth when there's opportunities coming up. You're sharing with them like, hey, I heard of this conference that's accepting submissions. I think you would be perfect for it. So it's essentially you're pulling someone up, and it can like really feel like that. And if you're looking to find a sponsor, I do think it's, again, important to be strategic about it. Usually you may look for someone who's at a higher position, higher level than you currently are, either in your organization or elsewhere. So you would also ask time from someone who's most likely very busy. And so being very clear about what you're looking for, the type of investment you would want from them, the reason you reached out to them and not to someone else, and the type of support that you would be looking for and why, I think is really important. So basically making a case for the kind of investment you would ask for from them. And it can be incredibly helpful to have someone like that. It might be, a chief architect in your organization. It might be another lead engineer, or it might be someone on the management track. Whoever that person is, I would also, again, be strategic about who you pick. Like maybe they're not exactly in your direct line of hierarchy because those people are kind of already connected to you. So it might be useful to step out of that because, again, if you're looking to increase your impact, having that breadth in your approach can be really useful. One more thing I did want to highlight, again, to the distributed organization piece that Connor mentioned earlier. The visibility part is incredibly crucial there. Like I do think a lot of organizations are optimizing for more asynchronous work, which is phenomenal, big fan. But there is a piece in many organizations still, even if they say they're not like that, but there is often still a piece where basically being present in the right meetings makes a difference. And I hate it, but it can, or at least it can be a really crucial part of building that perception, which also means if you're looking to, like Connor in this case, level up in the sense of being perceived as someone who's operating at a higher level, who's leveling up their leadership skills, who's effective through others instead of being this problem solver yourself. If you're looking to do that, there can be something really important about finding the right meetings, because one part is the perception piece, being involved in the important conversations, but another part, entirely different but also crucial, can be about learning about bigger opportunities, learning about what's out there, where you might be able to get involved, where you might be able to represent your team. And with that, also not just being able to shift perception, but also actually broaden your impact, which, of course, like we're not just talking perception here, but also like doing the work. And so in distributed teams, the way that you show up in these conversations, what you bring to them, and especially framing things at a much higher level. If that's your audience, like if you're in more meetings with executives or with business leaders, doing that communication shift can be a really, really important piece.
Yeah. Also, there's 4 things I've done in my work that I feel like has really helped me with distributed teams and that perception. One, like you mentioned, getting into the right meetings, but I think also being intentional at asking for opportunities and pursuing growth. So great, you got in the meeting. Now you have to ask for the opportunity. Like, I want to be involved in this. I want to, raise my internal profile by making an impactful decision or working on this impactful project. And then something you mentioned earlier that I really love is like setting regular touch points to communicate with stakeholders, even if it's not like strictly necessary. So they have visibility and see you making progress or can give feedback. I think like we miss that casual office conversation of an in-person office where, if you're intentionally trying to network or whatever else you might be, like, I know it's a dirty word in some circles, but you need that face-to-face time. And so you need to find other ways to resonate with them in distributed teams and ensure that they feel included, because, man, those folks make a lot of decisions that impact your career, the work you get. And one way I do that is like scheduled Slack messages to do like regular internal. I love a scheduled Slack message because I'll be writing something at like 7 p.m. I'm just thinking about it. And I'm like, I shouldn't send this right now. So I'll schedule it and say, okay, like
also good
stakeholder update kind of thing.
Nice.
And then I loved also your suggestion about content and like finding a way to either like write or, communicate another way about the work you're doing, whether it's, go on someone else's podcast or whatever else. This may feel like unnatural at first, but it's a huge differentiator. People usually don't know what you're up to unless you tell them, and you can leverage LinkedIn or Twitter for internal and external visibility. And I think it drives home for me a point about like in this like digital world that we are increasingly moving into, attention is everything. And so like you need to be able to create content of some type, whether it's a tweet, a Slack messages, a video, go on a podcast, right? Whatever it might be, like you need to get people's attention if you want to improve perception, if you want to improve your impact.
And I'm going to just offer a different angle for anyone who feels weird about marketing, which I know some people do, and that actually might prevent you from being more effective in this area. But there is also real value to this. Like, people don't know what's in your head.
Yeah.
And especially in these, like, in the times that we're working in the new environments where we're all trying to figure out how to navigate increasing complexity, there is so much value to people sharing real experiences, the real work that they're doing, and putting those things out there within their companies, within their teams, but also like with the rest of the world. So I think there is a huge value that you can create by sharing that, and as a benefit, also shifting some perception about what you're doing.
I totally agree. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I know we're over time here on our recording, so I don't want to keep you too long, but I want to make sure we get in any like last points you had that we didn't get to in our discussion. Was there anything else that you want to make sure we highlight here?
I think just 2 points really. The one is the feedback. You brought it up, which I thought was really great. But I keep anything about perception, I keep it small, experiment, but try and get as much feedback as quickly as possible, because as you also said earlier, like, some people have preconceived notions and it may take a while to actually change those, but don't make this the mega project, and keep it small and incremental. And the other part is what we also briefly touched on earlier, like, note your progress. So keep track of the things that you're trying, because it can also be really like frustrating if your experiments don't land in the way that you expected, or you have to iterate much longer. And so having that sense of progress still is really important. And last aspect of that, always keep a brag doc. So keep a document where you write down your accomplishments, positive feedback you're getting, anything, projects you land, numbers you hit, whatever it is. Have that on hand just for yourself, but also keep it around for performance review season. I know that's the case for many people right now. But build that record of the work that you're doing, because the perception is one part, but then the work that you're doing is also a really important part of it, and that mustn't be forgotten.
And also, as a leader, like, build a culture that celebrates success. Even if the broader organization doesn't do a great job of doing this, that doesn't have to extend to your team. People want to know their work matters, like we talked about earlier, and you'll have a happier, more fulfilled, more effective team who's also going to be perceived better.
Exactly. And like, to that, you mentioned it earlier as well, but as leaders, we need to be so mindful of our own perceptions of others. Like, we've talked a lot about sort of creating perception, but in the same way, like, be mindful of the biases you bring to your interactions, to your conversations, and how you show up as a leader when it comes to that, including in performance reviews, but also just in the day-to-day work, who you give opportunities to, how you interact with people, all of those things.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, like, providing team members transparency and including them in conversation so that they know they're making an impact and they can see the impact they're making beyond just, oh, I need to build this thing, giving them the reason and the why, can not only inform them to do better in the actual work, but also make them feel more included, improve their internal perception, which again, is also reciprocally valuable for you, and make sure you're actually building better products.
And it can help them elevate themselves,
Great point.
because they're getting different kind of context, and with that can also make that leap that you're trying to make right now.
They may bring those insights to the conversation that you wouldn't expect from their own perception and viewpoint.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation. Like, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed this. And if everyone listening did as well, like, let us know in our Discord, discord.gg.devinterrupted, or /devinterrupted, and maybe we'll have you back on the pod again. I'd love to kind of dig into one of these other topics.
Me too.
Good. Great. We're going to make it happen.
Let's do it.
So I also like to give our guests an opportunity to close out the podcast with like a call to action. I know we talked a bit about it in advance, like, you have a great Twitter, you have a great website. Like, what do you want the engineering team leads and, CTOs, EPs, devs listening to take away? Like, is it go check out your website? What do you want them to do?
All right. I have a website. It's lenareinhard.com. I do occasionally write about leadership topics. I'm on Twitter at LRNRD, and the Twitter is also linked from other places if you're struggling with the weird letters.
In the script.
And that's really it. Exactly. And I'm actually starting to run workshops that are public. The first one is in London in just a month, about becoming a successful change leader. So if you're into that, you should come by. There's still a few tickets.
Amazing. Yeah, definitely check it out. Her website is great. And if you happen to be in London or can make it, I think that would be a fantastic workshop. I also do want to give a quick reminder for our listeners. If you love this episode or any other episode of Dev Interrupted, please, if you haven't already, rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It makes a huge impact for us in helping our show get discovered and a perception so we can bring on more incredible guests like Lena. And be sure to check out the Dev Interrupted Discord community, which we've shouted out a couple times. We have conversations like this all week. We're going to talk about a lot of these topics that we talked about today and follow up on them. And then I do want to just give another quick shout out to the more than 2,000 of you who are subscribed to our weekly Interruption newsletter, bringing you articles from the community, inside information on our weekly podcast. Thank you so much, everyone, for all your support. Make sure to rate and subscribe. And we'll have links to all in the description below. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you.